Now, if you're reading this article on or around, or even past April 15th, it may be because Donald Trump recently complained to foes shun insanity about wind turbines, also known as or what he likes to call windmills. He ran through a familiar litany about the number of birds killed by turbine blades and the purported cost of wind for generating the energy. Now, if you have heard Trump talk about wind turbines, or as he likes to refer to them as windmills, you would have heard what he told Insanity. Now, if you're reading this at any other point in the future, you're reading it because Trump offered Insanity or someone else the same complaint on the same subject. You're reading this article because you were curious enough to finally Google why does Donald Trump hate windmills, and thanks to the magic of search engine optimization, you landed yourself here. Now, because Trump will never stop complaining about windmills or wind turbines, it is because his oldest political opinion, and one that is almost completely impervious to any reason. In this light, it's instructive. No one will convince Trump that he's wrong about wind turbines, or that his rationales for hating wind turbines are outdated and wrong. But he would dig in simply because people are telling him that he's wrong. This is what we should expect for most of his fervently expressed political views. This particular story of the wind turbines begins 16 years ago in the country Scotland. In 2006, Trump bought a large chunk of property on the country's northeastern coast with the goal of turning it into a golf resort. 6 years later, it opened up as Trump International Golf Links. It was not as smooth. It was not a smooth path as Trump would have hoped for, but the local government originally rejected his proposal out of concern that the area where he hoped to build was environmentally sensitive. The national government stepped in on Trump's behalf, however, and construction began in 2010. What Trump appears not to have known when he bought the land, though, is that 3 years prior, a new offshore wind farm had been proposed. Following preparatory work, a formal application for construction was filed in 2011, and that's when the war started. At the outset, Trump had only one concern: that the offshore turbines would ruin the view from his golf course. Um, After all, he clearly had no objection to environmentalism at one point. At one point, he insisted that his proposed resort has received tremendous support from environmental groups, and that the resort was actually the greatest thing that he's ever done for the environment. In short order, Trump had filed a complaint against that farm. Trump's relationship with the Scots deteriorated, in part because he launched a war against the local family whose property he wanted to buy, a war that he won in court but led to his being eviscerated in public. Michael Forbes, no, yeah, Michael Forbes, one of the people resisting Trump's buyout effort, was named the top Scotland award sponsored by the Glenfiddich whiskey brand, prompting Trump to ban the liquor from his properties, and there was also a documentary made about it. This was also the point at which Trump's opposition to wind turbines became intermingled with politics. He began criticizing the Scottish officials on Twitter, including at least one official who had helped him overcome local opposition in the first place. He started tweeting regularly, hundreds of times a day, about the purported threats that are imposed by the wind turbines. Turbines are disgusting looking, noisy, and bad for people's health. He claimed. Yeah, Trump, you're disgusting, all right, and you're ugly and noisy because you don't shut up. But it's not bad for people's health. They threaten the migration of birds. No, they don't. They are ruining the beauty of parts of the country, and they're bad for the environment. Yeah, Trump, you're bad for the environment, and they cause tremendous damage to the local ecosystems. Yeah, like you did. Yeah, and they are a scourge to communities and wildlife. They kill so many birds that they make hunters look like nice people, and so on. Now, in a familiar pattern, Trump took isolated anecdotes or unconfirmed accusations and elevated and exaggerated them to try to overpower his opponents. Back in 2013, at one point, for example, he shared a story about a wind turbine collapsing in an effort to persuade a Scottish lawmaker he had worked with previously to block the proposed wind farm. He also intertwined his attacks on wind power with American politics, and the release of Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth brought increased attention to the climate change in the United States, with politicians generally lining up in support of efforts to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions. In 2009, this included Trump himself, who was one of the business community signatories to an ad that ran in New York Times calling for action. Now, the election of Barack Obama and the emergence of the Tea Party movement, though it overlapped with a federal effort to curtail emissions, that quickly became a point of political opposition for the Republicans. Now, by the end of Obama's first term, climate change was firmly embedded in the culture war rate. Now, with the GOP criticizing his efforts to expand what they call the green employment and energy production, Trump was by then um, touting a presidential run, and he folded his complaints about wind energy in Scotland into a social media patter here in the United States. Now, that campaign didn't go anywhere. When Trump did decide to run 4 years later, he focused far more on immigration than the climate. Which is an interesting episode in November of 2015, though the primary frontrunner was forced to confront his anti-wind pass. Um, at a town hall in Iowa, a woman's husband who worked for a local turbine manufacturer asked Trump if he supported subsidies for the wind energy production. Trump had basically scoffed at the subsidies repeatedly, but he was also a guy who had spent decades figuring out how to close the deal. So here was a voter whose vote he needed, and suddenly Trump's position went from never to I'm okay with subsidies to an extent. And this was about as close to an embrace of wind power that Trump would offer. And once he was installed, he dropped any sense of wanting to appeal to those who didn't already support him and mocking wind turbines because of his campaign rally shtick. He would regularly push the line of his complaints as when he suggested that maybe the sound from wind turbines causes cancer because it doesn't. It was never really clear that even it wasn't it was never really clear that even if he understood the basic elements of how climate change works, and that would explain why wind energy was useful. But this is besides the point. He had a go-to applause line that hit all the right enemies, like the Democrats, hippies, environmentalists, weirdos, and so on. So he deployed it over and over again, partly because it worked out and partly out of habit. Because this is meant to be a compendium of Trump's views on the subject, so we should quickly run through all of his claims and debunk or contextualize them, and so on. Wind turbines can kill birds as a New York Times story that ran the week of his April interview with Insanity discussed. Initial research suggests that painting one blade black reduces this risk, but Trump's complaints about saving migratory birds are undercut quite a bit by the fact that his administration tried to hollow out a law protecting those birds, and by the fact that Trump is a big proponent of another, much more frequent killer of birds, buildings. Wind energy is a relatively inexpensive form of energy, and while it is dependent on wind, obviously, there are systems like batteries that can store energy for times when wind is in the lower supply. It's also not the case that Texas power outage in the winter of 2021 was a function of freezing turbines. The United States imports a lot of wind turbine parts from overseas. There are hundreds of domestic manufacturers as well as in Iowa, and part of the push a decade ago was for the country to invest more in the production of turbines, solar equipment, and batteries in the United States, and to not lose an economic advantage. But that push was stymied in part by political opposition to spending money on green energy. And that Trump keeps making broad and often outdated claims about wind energy is not surprising, and this is what the fuck he does. What is remarkable is that this particular thing has become so fixated in his patter. Before mentioning the subject on Insanity's show in April, he did so back in March and in January. He can't resist it. It's simply part of his political worldview. However modeled with air and despite the bizarre genesis of his obsession. After a brief victory for Trump's efforts to block the wind farm off the coast of Scotland, it was built and began operation in 2018. It has an installed capacity of 96.8 megawatts of energy, enough to power 80,000 homes. But there are no reports of turbines collapsing and no known incidents of noise-related cancer. Now, if you saw the photos of the course at Trump's resort posted on Instagram, there are no turbines that are visible in the distance on his golf course. So he's full of shit. So if you like the video, you can give the video like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And just for a few bucks a month, you can donate to the channel, and it helps go a long way, and it will further support the channel. And thanks for listening.